The book's called Shortest Way Home, and to be honest, I didn't know that I would be doing what I'm now doing politically when I decided to write the book. The reason I wanted to write the book was that I realized that people didn't really understand our part of the country very well, that we were painted with a broad brush, and there was a chance to really use some of the stories from our part of the country to change the way that people, especially people on the coasts, who have suddenly decided that the Midwest is important, but don't quite understand us in a lot of ways, to understand what's really going on here, and to do that through my own personal story. One thing that, especially when I'm traveling the country, reporters want to know a lot about is my relationship with our current vice president. It's a complicated relationship. I'm on my third Republican governor now, and I pride myself on working well with people who have different ideas than I do. But I have to say that among our three Republican governors, Governor Pence was different from the others in a way that really harmed our state. I don't need to tell an Indiana audience about the whole religious freedom debacle. Although if you want to read about what it was like for me, you can. As you know, they ended up doing a fix. The fix said that it meant that you can't discriminate on the basis of this law. The proponents of the law said, you can't do that, that defeats the purpose of the law. All of us said, exactly, that's why it needs to go, and so on. The fix was not exactly a leap forward in LGBT inclusion. An effort failed the next year to actually establish a civil rights policy, which meant going forward that in many parts of Indiana, people could still be fired for being gay. Embarrassingly, we also remained one of just 5 American states with no ban on hate crimes. But the whole episode showed that trying to appeal to radical social conservatives no longer worked in Indiana, because it would run afoul of what most people believe, including typically conservative groups like the business community. The controversy crippled Pence's reputation as governor and created an opening for his Democratic challenger, John Gregg, to mount a credible campaign against him for the governor's office in 2016. What no one could have known then was the future benefit to Pence of establishing himself as a hero to the religious far right, a political martyr almost. It made him into a brilliant, if cynical, choice of running mate for Donald Trump. Nominating an evangelical heartland governor was the best way for a thrice-married, formerly pro-choice, philandering ex-Democrat like Trump to reach out to the and begin unifying the fractured right around his candidacy. And while Trump's life story was anathema to everything Mike Pence believed in, this was the right move for Pence, too, if viewed in the cynical light of raw politics. The governor had lost respect on both sides of the aisle in his home state, and was now widely expected to lose his re-election. Strange bedfellows though they were, Mike Pence and Donald Trump needed each other. Win or lose, teaming up with Trump could give Pence a second political life. We're turning some heads in this presidential exploratory campaign. A lot of it is based on a generational appeal, and it's not just being from a young generation, addressing voters from a young generation, but it's really about inviting all generations to think about what's changing around us. So I write for a while about what it was like growing up in South Bend, how South Bend rose and fell and began to rise again, and how I began to feel a tug toward home. I was one of those, as so many of us do, especially in Indiana, who grew up believing that success meant getting out. And that's what I did. I went to the East Coast for college, I went overseas for more school, and the further away I got, the more I began to realize that I was actually from somewhere, that home meant something. And I felt that tug that I think a lot of us do, that sooner or later you gotta go home. Newsweek ran a story called America's Dying Cities. The authors analyzed demographic data, especially declines in the population of young people, to arrive at the conclusion that 10 communities in particular epitomized urban decay and were on their way out. Most were in the Midwest. South Bend was number 8. The short commentary concluded with this. What is particularly troubling for this small city is that the number of young people declined by 2.5% during the previous decade, casting further doubt on whether this city will ever be able to recover. I had just turned 29. South Bend reacted intensely. A Facebook thread from the time captured the range of opinion. Doesn't surprise me a bit, one resident said, summing up a general pessimism among many who had seen employers' jobs and stores disappear. The demographic, the workforce, even the economy is all going downhill, said another. But in the comments and the coverage of the time, you could also see the stirrings of a resistance to the doom and gloom narrative, especially among young people. On the same thread, a classmate of mine commented, "If you live here, quit complaining and do something to fix this town." To make several other long stories short, that's what a group of friends and I decided to do. It led to running for mayor. We won. And thank you. The real denial, and the more costly, was to persist in believing that South Bend could only thrive as an old school automaking company town, dependent on a single massive employer. I would encounter this thinking even a half-century later in 2011, when I was running for mayor. I heard it as a refrain among those who said that what we needed was to land one mythic giant factory, to lure something big here from somewhere else and get some version of Studebaker taking root again. This was the impossible promise that held us back. And seeing this promise go unkept, my generation grew up suspecting that our only hope was to get out. Progress could begin only once the loss had been fully metabolized. Nothing is more human than to resist loss, which is why cynical politicians can get pretty far by offering up the fantasy that a loss can be reversed rather than overcome the hard way. This is the deepest lie of our recent national politics, the core falsehood encoded in "Make America Great Again." Beneath the impossible promises that coal alone will fuel our future, that a big wall can be built around our status quo, that climate change isn't even real, is the deeper fantasy that time itself can be reversed, all losses restored, and thus no new ways of life required. To defeat this temptation is to see what actually lies on the other side of acceptance. Not diminished expectations, but still greater ones. For us, paradoxically, the only way to relive anything like our hometown's former greatness is to stop trying to retrieve it from our vanished past. If manufacturing is to grow around here now, its growth will not come by reverting to a world of cut-off trade routes and pre-computer production methods. It will come from those of our employers who seek to compete in new ways, and from new arrivals, like the Silicon Valley-based startup that bought the entire facility housing the old commercial Hummer production line. Backed by investment from China, the company is making partially automated electric vehicles using local union labor. Enterprises like this take globalization and automation as their point of departure and work through these forces rather than against them. The founders of car manufacturing here would scarcely recognize this industry as their own, but it echoes their originality and audacity, showing that the less we concentrate on emulating our forebears, the more we begin to resemble them at their best. Okay, one more thing that's important to me in the book, and that's, in addition to being kind of a love letter to the city of South Bend, it's also a love letter to Chastity, my husband. And it's about the experience of coming out. And then the experience of dating, which is a little complicated if you're a mayor and you're gay. So here's a little bit about how I thought of all that when I was trying to figure that out. I had come out of the closet in order to make it possible, at last, to create a meaningful personal life. I was already well into my 30s and hoping to have a family someday. The politics were what they were. Now that I didn't have to worry about being spotted or outed, it was time to start dating. But how? How is a gay mayor, or any mayor, supposed to go about getting a date? The closer to home I looked, the harder it seemed. It could be an ethical minefield. A mayor in his own city can certainly get his calls returned, but there's also the risk that someone will completely misunderstand why you're inviting them to meet for a coffee at Chicory Cafe or a pint at Fiddler's Heart. Farther afield, friends from college were willing and eager to introduce me to people that they knew. But most of the eligible guys in question lived in New York or Washington. To most of them, I was lost in the expanse of so-called flyover country, probably even more remote than if I were overseas. Since I wasn't moving anytime soon, I was going to have to think closer to home. But when it came to South Bend, it wasn't even clear where to look. I thought of the countless local doctors and business leaders of my parents' generation who had seemed intent over the years on fixing me up with their bright and lovely daughters. Where were these would-be matchmakers now? And how was it that not one of them had a son or nephew that they wanted to meet? My city had never felt so small. In the military, sometimes they talk about training age to describe the difference between longevity and experience. For example, if you're a 40-year-old major trained in field artillery and then switched to intelligence, you might have the same training age as a private first class 20 years your junior when it came to a specific skill like cryptography. That's how I felt about dating and romance. I was in my 30s, but my training age, so to speak, was practically zero. On my 33rd birthday, I was starting my 4th year as the mayor of a sizable city. I had served in a foreign war and dined with senators and governors. I had seen Red Square and the Great Pyramids of Giza, knew how to order a sandwich in 7 languages, and was the owner of a large historic home on the St. Joseph River. But I had absolutely no idea what it was like to be in love. There's a happy ending, by the way. Read all about it. At Chaston, we got married in June. This, by the way, is a big part of how we're paying for the wedding that we had. Thank you for taking a moment to purchase if you did so.